So right, all on mic saying something we should. Not good.
All right, everyone, welcome. My name is Alex Colvin, and I am the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, and I'm so excited to welcome you here for another installment of our Food for Thought lecture series. Before we begin today's program, I have just two quick announcements. The first, I want to make sure that you're all aware of our temporary exhibition, History Lives On, Alabama's Rosenwald Schools. It is currently on view on our second floor. Now, what I will warn people is our public elevator is currently down for construction, so you will have to use the stairs. If you cannot go up the stairs, please let a staff member know, and we'll be able to use one of the staff elevators to get you upstairs, all right? Now, the second thing I want to make sure you're aware of is that our Food for Thought lecture series continues next month, as Dr. Michael Inez Jimenez will come present on Mexican culture and cuisine in Alabama history. And that will be on Thursday, September 19th, here in the Farley Auditorium and online. I would like to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance and the Friends of the Alabama Archives for sponsoring our Food for Thought lecture series. It would not be possible without their support. Now on to today's program. I am very excited to welcome our speaker. A native of Sprott, Alabama, William Underwood Eiland has recently retired after 33 years of service to the University of Georgia as director of the Georgia Museum of Art. And today he is going to share with us stories about 19th century portraiture here in Alabama, specifically the Black Belt. Please join me in welcoming Bill Eiland.
This is working.
Was it not working?
Yeah, that one. Sorry. I'm glad to be back in Alabama because what I can tell you right from the beginning, I know if you're from Alabama, you'll understand it. A good friend of mine went to the University of Alabama, where she pledged one of the better known sororities. She went home to see her mother at Christmas, and she said that her sorority sisters had told her that she didn't need to bring her china, crystal, and silver, that it was all right to use plastic cutlery and paper plates. And her mother looked at her with a little scornful look and said, "Your sorority sisters must be from North Alabama." Today, I'm going to ignore not only Dorothy Parker's quip that brevity is the soul of lingerie, as well as our own Tallulah Bankhead's asseveration that only good girls keep diaries. Bad girls don't have time. I hardly know exactly what I am doing, re-giving this talk. This was given for the bicentennial of the state of Alabama. And so you'll pardon me if some of it refers to that. I'm not going to be talking about my first visit back. But I will tell you that at the University of Georgia, much as at Birmingham Southern College, which is where I went to school, and which unfortunately no longer exists, I watched the students of 2024 as I did in 2019, and I'm watching them closely and I find them content unto themselves. Indeed, they come and go, at least in the library, with some even speaking of Michelangelo. They are beautiful beings, all of them. Though some are lumpy and acne-ridden, bedraggled and self-conscious, they are beautiful, because they are young. But I'm not here to write or to speak of them. Rather, I am seeking information on their ancestors, on those mostly Southerners who lived some 200 years ago when Alabama first joined the Union. Not my first foray into Southern post-colonial history, but this time I am looking for portraits of enslaved peoples, of indigenous peoples, of the women behind those elaborate dresses and severe hairstyles. In that era, I will not find them, hard as I look, except in the lithographs from Thomas McKinney and James Hall's History of the Indian Tribes of North America, first published in 1837, and which contain biographical profiles of Indian leaders. You can see them also here. What I do find are the usual suspects from the literature of Alabama's social, economic, political, and cultural history. Those affluent or better to do residents of Alabama's post-frontier society, its lawyers, its doctors, its educators, but most of all, its so-called planters. I will have to wait until years later if I am to find the overlooked, the marginalized, and the neglected. I have to anticipate the advent of photography, where the general population has or can find the money to afford an image, even a self-portrait. Through the advent of the camera, they became visible as folk, as entitled as the well-to-do, to the portrait of a loved one, to the photograph as aide memoire, as ingress to a personal history. What I do find in the history of Alabama as it changed status from territory to state in a relatively short period of time were the different expectations of planter and yeoman, of North and South Alabamian, of settler and politician, of rural and urban population. What I also find is that those theorists who argue that portraiture is not necessarily truth would find the images of early Alabamians pertinent to their arguments. I do thank you for inviting me back to Montgomery for this occasion. Nothing makes me prouder than to return to a state too often calumniated, the object of profound obloquy, perhaps deserved, but for all that, my home, a place where people speak my language, share my diphthongs, eschew my R's. If I may paraphrase one of Mary Catherine Wyndham's loveliest stories, it is where we can go home again, in spite of our shortcomings, in spite of our inability to speak French. Some of us here may speak French, but our lingua franca, if you will pardon the double entendre, is English, Southern English to be precise, with its gamut of Alabama dialects and accents. I am from Perry County, almost the center of the Black Belt, that place, if you will, featured in James Agee's and Walter Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, a region of Alabama still home to or visited by writers and artists, certainly future architects at Auburn's Rural Studio. Such thinkers as the late William Christenberry from Greensboro and Mary Ward Brown from Marion Junction, both, like others, intent on finding their roots or discovering the mysteries of what is too often seen as benighted land. It was not always that way, even though its history of slavery and discrimination and violence, in short, what was to come, were already suggested there as elements in its colonial beginnings. My requested subject today is portraiture of federal area Antebellum, Alabama, but I've taken that assignment as a provocation to make of my talk a portrait not just of its peoples, but of the very state itself, what it was and what it was to become, the seeds of its successes and failures sown at its very birth, and no place more emblematic than my home in the heart of the Black Belt, where portraiture was particularly esteemed as a mark of distinction. As such, we must briefly look at the history we share with Europeans, and particularly, but through other continent stories as well, images in dye and paint and stone of individuals both revered and despised, captured on the walls of the pyramids of Egypt, in the portrait bust of Rome, and in the post-Alexandrian Gandharan faces of sometimes mustachioed Asians. Succinctly, as an unidentified writer of wall text for a collection of old master paintings in El Paso, Texas, explains, quote, Renaissance Italy witnessed a remarkable awakening, the rediscovery of classical writings, philosophies, and art that emphasize the value of the individual. Along with this awareness came the reintroduction of the portrait. Not since classical antiquity had the independent likenesses of men and women been popular. But during the 15th century, an unprecedented number of portraits were commissioned alongside sacred subjects. Over the next 250 years, the representation of the individual underwent an extraordinary transformation. Initially commissioned by the elite as social documents and symbols of wealth, portraits appeared on canvas, medals, busts, and tombs. The earliest examples are small in size and stress the accomplishments of men and the virtues of women. By the mid-16th century, artists began to depict individuals from varied social classes on an increasingly grand scale. 17th century Baroque artists painted dramatic scenes, such as Caravaggio, while those of the 18th century Rococo favored elegance and grace. Throughout, the expressions of identity was paramount. Attributes as symbols, documents, wealth, honor, intellect, and sometimes pride. Certainly, the portraits coincident with Alabama's statehood record the sitter's wealth, pride, and sometimes his or her intellect, almost always social position, and honor especially those commissioned as jurists or government officials. We must remember that Central and North Alabama, prior to statehood, did not share the same benefits as Mobile and the coastal areas, where French and Spanish influences can be seen particularly in official and domestic architecture. As the WPA-era writers of Alabama, A Guide to the South, Arts and Culture, Crafts, remark, the struggle for existence was too engrossing to permit any flowering of formal art. Likewise, the pioneers who settled in northern and central Alabama in the early 19th century were too occupied with gun and axe to devote time to chisel and brush. During this period, wealthy planners in particular sought out such artists as the Peel family of painters or Thomas Sully to immortalize themselves. Though hardly known as the portraitist of human beings, even John James Audubon visited Mobile and is said to have found there the model for his painting of the hummingbird that appeared in Birds of America. But primarily, artists themselves came south in search of patrons and commissions. Such men as William Fry, Edward Troy, Joseph Thornton Moore, and Nicola Marshall are among the better known of the artists who actually settled in Huntsville, the Black Belt, Montgomery, Tuscaloosa, or Mobile, at least for part of their careers. Other artists, such as George Cook, were peripatetic and are known to have traveled to Greensboro, to Demopolis, to Florence, to Selma, and of course to Prattville, for example, and to have enjoyed the hospitality of patrons as they journeyed to find commissions. Edward Troy came to Mobile from Philadelphia in 1849, a little late for the period under discussion, but important to note because of his tenure as a professor at Spring Hill College for some 6 years. There in his studio on Bienville Square, he specialized in portraits and landscapes, but upon discovering the racehorses of Kentucky, he became known as the Landseer of America for the mastery of his equine portraits. In short, for his increasing negligence of the human for the animal. Born in North Yarmouth, Maine, Joseph Thorts Moore moved from Ohio, where he was an itinerant artist, to Montgomery circa 1830 with his wife and 3 children. There he opened a studio where he taught painting and drawing. He was primarily a portraitist, but also advertised himself as a sign and ornamental painter. It is said that he painted more than 400 portraits before death from yellow fever in 1854. His daughter, Harriet Newell Moore Hosea, became a miniaturist. Moore is buried here in Montgomery in Oakwood Cemetery. Another teacher, this time at Marion's Female Seminary, Nicola Marshall, who was born in 1829 and died in 1917, so he had a good long life. He came to Alabama from Prussia on or around 1849. After landing in Mobile, where he stayed for some 3 years, he headed north to Marion, where he taught art, French, and violin. His was a successful tenure in Alabama, with his portraits widely sought by those who could afford them. Early works by Marshall, before he returned to Europe in 1857 for further training, reflect a certain naivete, a clumsiness of execution, as in this portrait of baby Caroline Carlisle and her mother. The artist even served in the Confederate Army and designed its uniform, and some stalwart members of the UDC in Alabama insist to this day that he also designed the Confederate flag, the stars and bars. I hate to be partisan, especially in Montgomery, Alabama, in this case, but I think the jury is no longer out, and that the latter achievement, such as it was, belongs to an artist in North Carolina and not to an artist in Alabama. At any rate, his paintings of the well-to-do of Alabama and Kentucky after his return from Europe and after the war became much more accomplished technically. Note his signature in this painting right at the, let's see if I can get the pointer. Can you see it? His paintings, however, of this period, of this later period that lasted until 1917, lose their charm in a more formulaic and stiff presentation. One of Marshall's earliest works in Alabama also illustrates another dichotomy, this time the graceful figure of a little girl, the Hale Child, a painting found in a barn in Marengo County. But this is no ordinary portrait. Rather, it is a post-mortem image, specifically a mourning painting, or perhaps better stated in this case, a commemorative painting of a dead child. Rather than a painting of a cadaver, a practice particularly of newborn babies, but even with adults. This portrait is of a child standing as if waiting to play, while an angel pauses to encircle the child and carry her off to heaven. You will note here the symbols of the child's status, living on the campus with her coral necklace and music box, apparently a favorite of hers, yet dead, in fact, in her black shoes and hand extended toward the roses in a funerary urn. Around and above her, a willowy angel points heavenward. The subject of post-mortem painting of either sort is an entirely different and worthy study for another time. But we shall note here that these portraits of dead children and adults were not uncommon throughout the United States, especially frequent from 1830 to 1860, when advertisements appeared regularly from portraitists stating their skill in painting from cadavers and later from daguerreotypes. Any of these works may have used established symbols, such as we have seen a coral necklace and faded roses to alert the viewer that these were commemorative or mourning pictures meant to function, as the art historian Phoebe Lloyd tells us, as a means of communion between the living and the dead, or an icon for the bereaved, contemplating it was part of the mourning ritual. Because the artist represented the deceased as alive, as in this portrait by George Cook of Fairfax Lapsley, a delicate balance had to be maintained between life and death. It was achieved in two ways. On the one hand, the figure of the deceased, generally life-size, was placed in his former habitual environment. On the other hand, a death symbol, sometimes disguised, sometimes easily identifiable, was normally included. This portrait, commissioned from Cook by the child's father, is of Joseph Fairfax Lapsley. If you're from Dallas County, you know the Lapsley family, who died in 1847 at age 2. Cook completed this portrait in 1848. The horse is said to have belonged to the child, and Lapsley père apparently asked Cook to include the confluence of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers south of the Lapsley family home in Selma. His clothing, the horse, and the still life all suggest the affluence into which the child was to be reared. The tree stump, dead and disfigured on the very banks of the rivers, symbolize his untimely demise. Some of the symbols readily recognizable as clues to the death of the subject were weeping willows, drooping, broken roses that may be dropping their petals, or the morning glory, a symbol of the new life that to this generation was death itself. Such symbology, especially the rose, appeared often on tomb sculpture as well, especially in the Northeast. Other symbols are less easy to distinguish, but many include attributes that the family would associate with the deceased: toys, books, even clothing. Shepherd Alonzo Mount, the brother of William Sidney Mount, wrote of the portrait of his dead niece, Camille, that she's seen moving up on a light cloud, a leitmotif we see again and again in antebellum posthumous painting. Another frequent symbol for little girls was, as we have seen, coral necklaces. More general discussions of early Alabama material culture are beyond the scope of this talk, since we have so few portraits by women. By the way, one a student of Marshall's, Mary Eugenia Jones, and almost no portraits of the enslaved and indigenous prior to 1819. We note all along with the author of A Guide to the South, while the affluent toyed with painting and filled the role of patrons of art, slaves and members of the small farmer families developed rare skill with miter, box, handsaw, hammer, and needle. Many of the finely carved cabinets and mantels that graced plantation homes were made by skilled slaves who were adept in ornamental ironwork, tinsmithing, and shaping utensils of varied design from pewter. At the same time, women of a farmer household were necessarily adept with their fingers, working with straw, pine needles, and pine cones. They made baskets and ornaments to brighten their drab cabins. Every woman perforce learned the art of quilting, and many of these intricately beautiful designs may be found in Alabama houses today. Certainly, during the years before and after becoming a state, Alabama was a frontier society, one in which, as Henry W. Hilliard described it, the essential demand of society was to see every man manly and every woman womanly, close quote. Having more males than females, girls often married young, as early as 13 to 14 years old. And it is not surprising to know that divorce was rare and required the approval of the state legislature. In this planter society, men expected women, in the words of the historian Lee Rawls Atkins, to be pious, modest, compassionate, quiet, and dainty, by nature self-denying and self-spoken, a paragon of virtue. And so they were depicted in the era's portraiture. Moreover, once married, husbands expected their wives to be obedient to them as heads of household, to be submissive, quote, whose only reason for being was to amuse and serve her husband, bear his children, and train them in the ways they should go, close quote. In short, she was to be genteel, and by that was meant she was to handle all social obligations of the household, such as receiving callers, entertaining, and playing the varied roles of gracious hostess. She was to be chaste and pure, hiding any suggestions of pregnancy in public while enduring the pain of childbirth with silence. Women's diaries and letters of the period reflected their dissatisfaction with social restraints. And in one notable example, whom I'm sure you've all heard of, Octavia Walton Levert noted that, quote, to be fettered and bound, yet seeming to be free, was worse than slavery, close quote. She wrote angrily, quote, talk about bondage and slavery. This is real bondage, close quote. Thus were women represented in portraiture of the period, even in Thomas Sully's painting of Madame Levert herself. She smiled somewhat coyly from a contrapposto pose at the viewer as she sits in an interior darkened enough such that her beauty and the formality of her dress shine forth. She was called the belle of the nation for her beauty, her sophistication, and her intelligence. A proto-feminist, she was a polyglot who traveled to Europe and occasionally wrote of her peregrinations in Italian and French. As the granddaughter of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, George Walton, from Augusta, Georgia, she had considerable social capital and spent such cachet reigning over Mobile's antebellum world of ball and reception, of at-homes and carriage rides. She held a salon à la Française on Mondays when not in Saratoga Springs, in Europe or elsewhere. Beginning at 11 a.m. through the evening, she received, quote, writers, artists, teachers, politicians, foreign visitors, actors, and celebrities of all sorts gathered to discuss literature, the fine arts, politics, history, and philosophy, close quote. It would not be unrealistic to see Octavia Levert, in fact, as both torn by conflicting loyalties and symbolic of the mythologizing of Southern gentility, grand hostess, and at the same time, a spokesperson for women of all classes. Her husband was a prominent physician and gave the family considerable income. When the Marquis Lafayette visited Mobile in 1825, she conversed with him in French, From 1853 to 1855, she traveled in Europe, where her reputation preceded her, thus assuring her immediate acceptance into the upper ranks of British, French, and Italian society. Upon her return, she detailed her experiences in Souvenirs of Travel, a book of much interest to cultured Alabamians. She had 5 children over 10 years, while bemoaning loudly the status and perception of women under which she chafed brutally. In her own words, "Why should I strive in the path of learning? Who will ever appreciate them? Who will ever praise them?" Indeed, the reality of most women, the wives of yeomen, of the freed and enslaved African Americans, of the indigenous Creeks and Choctaws, and even for the bourgeois mistresses of the planters themselves, was quite another story. Education for the wealthier women were in female seminaries, for the middle class in so-called Blackberry academies, for the others barely or rarely attempted or even illegal in some cases. Such attitudes persisted well into the 20th century, when, for example, the artist Lamar Dodd remarked of his youth in western Georgia and his first job in eastern Alabama. In the South at that time, women painted china, men painted houses. As we have already seen, we do, however, know the identities, if not specific works, of many of the male artists of post-frontier Alabama. In fact, according to a typescript document in the state archives, right here, in fact, that document is entitled "Artists Who Painted in Alabama Before 1860." Almost certainly, it is a list created from a thorough review of newspapers of the period. It is notable that almost all of the men listed were classified as portraitists of one kind or another. In fact, 43 are so identified, 8 as miniaturists, and thus also portraitists, 10 as daguerreotypists, and 5 as ambrotypists. The latter 2 designations probably portraitists as well through photographic processes. Given the time constraints and the burden I am placing on your patience, I will not include here a discussion of the life and work of Philip Romer, who also came to the United States from Europe. We know that he was born in 1820, that he lived and worked in Mobile, that he served in the Confederate forces, but we have not yet confirmed his death date. We do know that he painted this arresting and piercing portrait of a Choctaw woman in 1850, a painting that indicates his European training, but with a New World subject. One artist, native born in Huntsville, was William Conrad Saunders, who reversed the pattern we have seen of Europeans coming to America. He spent several years in Italy studying art. Saunders seems to have spent considerable time in Mobile, where he maintained a studio in the 1840s and where he took commissions for portraits and history paintings. Among these early painters, in addition to Marshall, Moore, and Troy, is an artist named Cook, with dates indicated in 1822. The earliest in these lists, and possibly a reference to George Cook, whose dates are 1793 to 1849. If the same Cook who took out an ad in Montgomery's Daily Mail on April the 12th, 1860, then it cannot be George Cook, who died in 1849. But we do know that George Cook was in Richmond, Washington, D.C., and Montgomery in the years 1821 to 1823. A native of Maryland, George Cook traveled the South after having studied in Europe, where he copied the old masters. It is erroneously stated that this painting by Cook in the chapel at the University of Georgia today is in the largest of its kind in the South. It is certainly the most ambitious for its time and for the fineness of its execution. The businessman and early industrialist, whom you all know, Daniel Pratt, provided Cook a studio and gallery in New Orleans, and even had the artist buried in the Pratt family cemetery in Prattville, Alabama. The artist William Fry came to the United States in the early 1840s from Europe. Born in Breslau in 1822, George Wilhelm Frey, later anglicized Fry, spent his formative years in Vienna and received instruction in Prague and in Heidelberg. Peter Baldaya, in the publication commemorating the bicentennial Alabama Creates, notes that in Germany, Fry was likely influenced by the high-toned coloration and intense realism of the Biedermeier school of painting. While still a student, Fry became fascinated with James Fenimore Cooper's historical romances of frontier and Indian life, and was compelled to travel to America to experience the young country firsthand. Fry first opened a studio in Louisville, Kentucky, and a couple of years later, owned around 1858, a second one in Huntsville. According to an article of 1868 describing his sojourn in Greensboro, Alabama, to paint portraits, Fry lived in Huntsville for some 20 years. In North Alabama, he is known for his portraits, but one of his most relevant paintings for our dual purpose tonight is the image of the Alabama River of 1850. Fry returns from his travels throughout Alabama and reopens a studio in 1858, when we learn from an advertisement in the Southern Advocate that Mr. William Fry has returned to Huntsville and can be found at his old room and is ready to serve his friends and the public. An earlier notice of March 5th, 1847, indicated that the location of his studio at that time was the Bell Tavern, a felicitous location, quote, where portraits will be taken true to life, close quote. Fry became known throughout the South, so much so that he was commissioned for $3,000 through a nationwide competition to paint the portrait of Henry Clay for the state of Kentucky in 1865, a work that had the full approval of the state's governor. As Baldaya tells us, the end of Fry's life was marked by failing health after 1870, when he suffered several strokes and thus was committed to the Alabama Hospital for the Insane in Tuscaloosa, where he died at age 49 in 1872. Apparently, near the end of his life, he painted this oval portrait of a bearded African-American man with a glue bucket and brush, posed next to a page from the Louisville commercial. This photo is from a Case Antiques sale of January 27th, 2018, Lot 108, buyer unknown. The oval painting, portrait of genre, question mark, sold for $15,000. I gave you that detail because if you ever run across this painting, please let me know. I really am interested in this in particular. Painted portraits in Alabama prior to the 1840s may not give us the whole truth or context in which they were created, but they do give us a record of formal dress and fashion, of conventions of representation. I'm going slowly because I want you to see the various representations that I'm talking about, and even to a degree, cultural context. I've tried to include here such emblems along with the portraits. Of particular interest, I think, is the convention of a flower, a rose, or a carnation, even sometimes a camellia, at the décolletage of a lady's dress, again suggesting purity and piety. The scholars Dale Couch and Martha Severance both suggested to me that this motif is one introduced in Charleston, then spread westward by Jeremiah Theus in the 18th century. Here's a painting by Jeremiah Theus. The popularity of daguerreotypes or ambrotypes as media for portraits was immediate after the introduction of photography in Alabama by 1839. A daguerreotype is a photograph taken by an early photographic process employing an iodine sensitized silvered plate and mercury vapor. By 1846, Huntsville's Southern Advocate remarks, "The wonderful accuracy of portraits taken by this new process makes them truly valuable." It is not until later in the century that we have the first photograph of an unidentified Black man taken and developed by a Black photographer. According to Francis Robb's Shot in Alabama in 1839, after Samuel F.B. Morse, himself a portraitist, met Louis J.M. Daguerre in Paris, he published an article on daguerreotypy that revolutionized portraiture in Alabama. As she notes, the first photographs made in Alabama are portraits, and they were made within months after instruction in making daguerreotypes reached America. Both George Cook and Nicola Marshall, not quite so curiously, enjoyed much of their earlier careers in the Black Belt, a region later to give us the achievements of Anne Norton, Rose Weaver, Crawford Gillis. This is by Claire Weaver Parrish, all from Selma. And yes, from Montgomery. This is John Lapsley. This is by Crawford Gillis. And this is by Montgomery's own Anne Goldthwait. The earlier ones are all from Selma. And then the other artist from Montgomery is, of course, the neo-activist and feminist Anne Goldthwait, along with the social commentator Charles Shannon. Selma, billing itself as the Athens and Rome of North America, also thought of itself as a cradle, crucible even, for artists long before it became infamous for opposition to civil rights. Its symbol, a bridge, in this case, one to be crossed, rather than one that joined peoples, times, and places together. The name of this region of Alabama, where the planter reigned over his kingdom of cotton, and which cuts through the very heart of the deep American South, derives from a description of the land itself, the rich, dark earth that defines the area. Impassioned folk have lived here since it was first settled. Planters, and the enslaved who were the real planters at that time, because they were doing the work. Civil rights pioneers, the Ku Klux Klan, artists and educators, and always bureaucrats and politicians, as smarmy and principled or unprincipled as in any other region of the nation. The appellation itself, in spite of its benign geological origins, is now associated with traditions of racism and paternalism that linger and abide on assumptions as much as on perceptions, sometimes erroneous, often mean-spirited. The nomenclature arising from the soil rather than from the majority population of African Americans presents a certain paradox in which perception has taken on an historical truth, at least in the minds of those foreign to the region or who know it only from the poet, the sociologist, the politico, from the do-gooder, as well as from the true believer. The Black Belt has its share of professional Southerners, each with a story to tell, an opinion to express, a truth to be decorated and disseminated. Perhaps a little more eccentric or far-fetched, the rural legend is often as bizarre and barely credible as the urban variety. As I began this talk, and as I asked Alex to introduce me, I remind you that I hail from this part of Alabama, the Black Belt. I was born and reared in Sprott, Alabama, made famous in this photograph by Walker Evans, but most forcefully and poetically in the astringent but lovely prose of James Agee, who found the lights out all over Alabama, as entrenched as it was in poverty, despair, and disillusionment. The Black Belt is a place where, in the film of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, her mute singer played air music with his fingers. It is a place where ignorance is born from prejudice and vice versa, where illiteracy, unemployment, and race baiting are endemic enough to remain commonplace, albeit becoming daily less fathomable or less unfathomable for the rest of the nation, which has its share of the same problems. It is a place where boredom has been proposed as the true impetus for high rates of suicide, and if not death for the despondent, then exile to somewhere not there, to the place Thomas Wolfe sought, a land more kind and forgiving than our own. The Black Belt bleeds population, with the young abandoning the rural areas as soon as opportunity allows their departure for greener grass and a rosier future. Those who love this place, as I do, remain or return in spite of the environmental racism that was torn apart such communities as Uniontown and Email, two towns whose very names evoke a troublesome past and an uncertain future. For those increasingly few who remain in central and south central Alabama, many of them aged and dying, the lamps of the Black Belt at least glimmer, if not glow, not entirely extinguished by destitution and illiteracy. It is said that lonely, hot winds blow through such towns as Gee's Bend, Kalijah, and Thomaston, towns so scorching in summer that one sees the very air one breathes. Heat and humidity join the soil in defining this place, this land, this legacy of the planters and the enslaved, whose portraits have shown you today. I've tried to talk to you about who founded the state, its first citizens, and now in 2024, those who live outside the more affluent towns of North and East and extreme South Alabama. Those folks who have returned or who have stayed or have not yet left. They stay perhaps because of the state's oft panoramic beauty in its landscape of pine and pecan, of wiregrass and black dirt, of blue blood and redneck. We are all peoples of color. Just as we cannot recapture the untroubled days of our youth, the state of Alabama cannot return to the conflicts and glories of its founding, what we try to read in the faces of those Alabamians of early statehood. As we celebrated that bicentennial, it was incumbent upon us to remember that historicism is not history, and we are still in search of the true story of our past, one no longer mythological, exaggerated, or even fabricated, yet truly our own, our personal relation to who we are, to what we hold dear, to the quaint, lovely question the good people of extreme South Alabama used to ask when inquiring of your origins. Not where are you from, but more directly, more sincerely, more precisely, where do your people bury? No truer statement than the one we saw on the very walls of the Archives Museum. The state of Alabama was born out of the struggle of this land. Our forebears, for better or worse, recognized that truth as a social, political, and economic dynamic. Our artists, especially the portraitists of early statehood, understood their role in affirming the social construct, as well as reinforcing that relationship to the earth from which the state was carved. Annie Dillard described that bond so well. Quote, when everything else is gone from my brain, the president's name, the state capitals, the neighborhoods where I lived, and then at length, the faces of my friends, and finally the faces of my family. When all this has dissolved, what will be left, I believe, is topology, the dreaming memory of land as it lay this way and that. I thank you for listening to this admittedly personal description of early portraiture in Alabama, a talk that for me, for myself, has become a self-directed plea to return, to come home, to find again the part of me that will always be Alabama. Thank you.
We do have some time for some questions.
I will tell you in passing that after this was written, I had to be in the Northeast in Boston. And while I was there as a representative of the American Alliance of Museums. And I noticed that you had to get a badge. So I went up to get my badge, and in front of me was a woman who was adamant, she was vehement, because they asked what her pronouns were. And she said, they, them, and their. And so they made the name tag. And then the guy sitting there looked at me and he said, and what is your pronoun? Well, I didn't know. I don't know what my pronoun is. I don't know what gender normative is. I don't know what a lot of those things are. So I said, basically that I didn't know. He said, I need a pronoun. You've got to have your pronoun on here. What is your pronoun? And I said, well, I guess it's y'all. And he looked at me and he said, is that inclusive? And I said, put all y'all.
We have some time for questions. If the in-person audience is here, I can bring a microphone to you. And if you're online, just put it in the comments and it'll come to. You can make a comment, of course.
I will not be able to hear you.
My pronoun is yes, ma'am.
I do that as well.
I just want to comment, if I may, on what
Let me make sure I can hear.
Can you hear it? Hear it?
I don't hear well. I
I
had
just wanted
COVID and it's complicated.
comment, if I may, on what I perceive to be a real stoicism in most of these portraits, excuse me. Which is in contrast to, if you go to New Orleans at that same time, the portraits are much more influenced by, as you say, European artists with Baroque lighting and much more mystical lighting that came from like Velázquez in Spain and other artists that would employ shadow and much more drama, that kind of thing. This is completely without any of that, though it's from the same time period. And not only are they, what I saw also repeatedly is this sort of, and I'm a photographer, so I'll speak in these sort of terms, but you see this sort of side lighting, and then they'll depart from the lighting on the face. It's just flat from the front. It doesn't even make any sense. It's not logical lighting. And so it's just, the stoicism is remarkable. It's almost stamp-like. It's almost stamping a preconceived notion onto the portrait. That's what I'm seeing in most of those portraits.
Oh, I would agree with you. That's the way we talk about the limners and how from the Northeast. And I certainly agree with that as well. That observation is similar to yours, and that is that the limners had this flat surface, and on it they were going to create flattened images.
Where is Sprott, Alabama?
You know what? Visiting the archives. I love the archives. I work in the archives. I love the people here, but on not a single damn map in this whole place is Sprott. I looked for it all this morning. Couldn't find it. Sprott is in Perry County. It is about 14, maybe 10 miles to Marion. You know where Marion is, Marion Institute and Judson College, another defunct college in Alabama. And it is about 20 miles from Selma. So it's really it's closer to Plantersville, if you know that part of Alabama. You just proved that James A.G. was right. The lamps are all out in Alabama. Especially in Sprott.
This will be our last question here.
I wanted to ask about the Indian portraits that you showed. I've always wondered, and I'd be curious to know what you think about it as a student of this, how romanticized are those portraits, the famous ones that we see, as opposed to being realistic about the dress, the character, and so forth of the people depicted in those early Native American portraits?
Well, you have an answer actually in the archives, because they're on view here at the archives. And the response would, of course, be to the second part of what you said, that they were done, in fact, with the express intention to do exactly what you were talking about, was in some way to illustrate the culture, the notion of an identity, and that's, I urge you to see them represented here. They're on the
Yes,
first
those
floor.
are on the McKinney & Hall lithographs are on the second floor. And so you can see them in the hallway. We also have the William McIntosh portrait on view in our Voices Gallery, and This Is Our Land section. So you can see both of those there. And what I will say is you can, of course, read, as Mr. Eiland said, you can read on the thing the different kind of depictions of them. But All of those ones were done kind of with the permission of the Native people involved, and they were able to choose their dress. They were in Washington for a delegation, and so it wasn't kind of this voyeuristic look at them. It was a portrait that was done with consent.
It's interesting you asked that question because the archives is having to deal. If you go up into the archives, you're going to find some galleries closed, and things have been taken away from them. And that's because the archives is dealing with the question of the representation of indigenous peoples and the objects that identify them, just what you're talking about. But in this case, they're the objects that identify them that they use for identification. I urge you to go upstairs.
Thank you to everyone for joining us, and please thank my speaker again for us. Now, if you happen to see many of these portraits are on view in the archives right now. A lot of them are up on our third floor, which is currently closed, but for everyone who came in person, we wanted to give you a chance to go look at them. If you are interested in going up to the third floor, Lizzie Orlovsky, who is our digital history curator, she is going to take people up in a staffed elevator because the public elevator is currently closed. If you would like to stop off on the second floor to be able to see those McKinney and Hall lithographs and the Macintosh portraits, you can stop there as well. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you again next month.